Thank you. So we are I'm pretty excited to talk about this topic today. We are going to be talking about sex ed and where sex ed fits in terms of the conversation around domestic violence and sexual violence education and prevention. We're also going to be looking at the history of sex ed. So really, where does sex ed come from, and how does sex ed fit into, again, this broader conversation around domestic violence and sexual assault prevention. We thought that this would be a cool topic to include as April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and just thinking about the different ways that we can address sexual assault as a public health issue. How do we start early having these sorts of conversations with young people, and how do we help ensure that young people can work towards building healthy relationships as they enter into their first relationships and continue being in relationships as they get older. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so that everybody can see the presentation. So just give me one moment to get that started.
I'll probably fill it out later. I don't know what time it is.
Okay, so as I mentioned, today we are going to be talking about sex ed and prevention, including the history of sex ed, so we can understand really where this comes from and how it has historically been implemented in our communities and particularly in schools, because there is a long history of sex ed and where it comes from. So the first thing I would love for us to do is to do some introductions. Because we are a little bit of a smaller group today, if anybody wants to come off of mute and introduce themselves, we would love for you to be able to do that. Otherwise, if you all wouldn't mind putting your responses into the chat, just so that we know who's in the room. So if you could please share your name, your pronouns, the organization you're with, and your land acknowledgement if you know whose land you happen to be on. As you are putting that information into the chat, I did want to start with an initial conversation. Again, hoping that maybe some folks will want to come off mute. Otherwise, if people want to put their responses into the chat, really just wondering about what are your memories of sex ed? So did you have any sex ed classes when you were in school? And if you did, what did those classes look like? What sort of topics were covered? What topics maybe weren't covered? Who taught your sex ed class? Was it a teacher on campus? Did you have a guest speaker? So just kind of wondering, what are memories of sex ed for you? And again, you can come off mute if anybody wants to share. Otherwise, we'd love for you to put a response in the chat. So still having folks introduce themselves in the chat, your name, your pronouns, your organization, and your land acknowledgement if you know whose land you're on. And if you're thinking about it, what are your memories of sex ed? So we've got some people introducing themselves in the chat. Hello, Erica. Hello, Sunny. Hello, Malin.
I can go ahead and introduce myself, Melody.
Sure.
My Griselda Marquez, and I'm the Community Outreach Manager at Rainbow Services. And my pronouns are she, her, ella. So my first memory, and I remember being completely mortified. I was in 7th grade, and it was my science teacher, and his name was Mr. Lindo, and he was tasked with providing sex ed. And I remember him like going through like a male genitalia and using his own, for lack of a better word, package, like over his pants, like demonstrating. And I was just like, what is he doing? And now that I think about it, that's like completely inappropriate. But I remember as a like 7th grade, I'm like, ew, what is he doing? Like he's pointing to his own like junk was sort of like my thought. And it was just like really totally weird. And I think now as an adult, that's kind of weird. Like he maybe not appropriate. Maybe he should have used like some picture or something like that. But that was mine, just like being disgusted at how this teacher was like pointing at himself. And it was just weird and awkward.
It sounds weird and awkward. It sounds a bit traumatizing, actually, in terms of how this was demonstrated to you. So that's definitely something that makes me think having some sort of guidelines as to how we teach sex ed might be useful. And so that's part of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm sorry that you had to experience that, Griselda, but I appreciate you sharing the example with the group. Okay, also getting someone else checking in. Does anybody else want to share either in the chat or by coming off of mute what your memories of sex ed were while you were in school? Again, did you even have sex ed? If you did, what was covered or not covered? Again, who maybe taught the class? Was it a teacher? Was it a guest speaker? So just want to give a couple more moments for folks to think about that if they have a response.
I could share. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it, Sunny.
Okay. So me growing up in Korea, my sex education that I had was through the video. So we just watched the video together as a group, and that was it. So there was no question or anything. It was more like it was this video. We just watched it together, and it was about sexual assault, and pretty much. But that is pretty much it. I don't really remember anything else but that.
And how old were you about when you had this?
I was definitely in the elementary school. I don't really remember how old I was, what grade I was in, but I was in elementary school for sure.
Okay.
It was really cheesy, really old video.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Sunny. So that's an interesting perspective to see how sex ed is implemented in other countries, right? This presentation is focused on sex ed in the United States. And specifically, we are going to nail down a little bit into sex ed in California specifically. But that's interesting to hear the perspective of what it was like for you in South Korea. And I think, the whole video concept is something that happens here too. I definitely know people who got their sex education in a similar way. I had sex ed twice, once in 7th grade and once, I want to say, in 9th grade. So once in middle school, once in high school. And for the middle school session that I had, that was a combination of my teacher and a video also. So I think that that's pretty common. But what I think is interesting about what you shared, Sunny, is that you remember getting this education at a really young age. So that is something that is not as common in terms of sex ed being implemented in schools in the US. Was there someone else who wanted to come off of mute and share?
Sure, I can share.
Thanks, Miranda.
When we had sex ed in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and then like it would come up again and again, like through health class or biology. And I remember the teachers would tag team, so it was just our regular teachers, but they would have a male and a female teacher in each room. And so they'd separate by girls and boys because, of course, we're only binary. And I remember during recess in between, because it was like 4 hours, so it was a mix of videos and lecture. And I remember having to explain to my friends that using a tampon did not, in fact, prevent you from urinating, because even at the, like, after hours of like going through the biology and here's your anatomy, they had never covered the difference between urethra and vagina. So like people were very confused, and it was super heterocentric, of course. It was the 80s, unfortunately. So there was so much confusion, and it was also spurred heavily with, like, they didn't talk about sexually transmitted diseases beyond like herpes and chlamydia. They didn't talk about AIDS at all, because even though at that point, like, they had started using HIV as the language and so on, their assumption was that we couldn't be impacted because, of course, you know, you're going to be heterosexual, so it's only going to impact those people. Because I remember asking, like, they had done here's a box, everybody put in anonymous questions. And so, of course, some of those questions were like, what the hell? But others really spoke to how little they had explained to us, because people were very confused. And even with having it year after year, like, they didn't change anything. It was the exact same curricula each time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Miranda. So I heard you talk about a lot of things. I heard you say that you were also kind of young when you first started getting sex ed, which again is not that common. So that's pretty interesting. But as you pointed out, it was very heteronormative. I think that's pretty common, especially historically thinking about sex ed. We'll talk about that a little bit. Splitting the classroom by gender, I think, is pretty common, or was a pretty common practice. Again, because you're saying there was the expectation of heteronormativity. And I think that what you pointed out in terms of the AIDS and HIV conversation being missing because of that heteronormativity, I think is also a really interesting point that you point out. And also thinking about how you said they use the same curriculum year after year. I think dosage, right? Dosage is something we talk about in prevention, like, which can be important, hearing the same things over and over again. And at the same time, I think it's important to change information or add information or look at information in a more nuanced way as youth get older and grow in their understanding of sexuality. So thank you for sharing that, Miranda. I'm also seeing in the chat, Malin shared that there were scare tactic photos of STIs in middle and high school. I think that is definitely something that was happening a lot in our schools. It makes me think of that scene from Mean Girls. I don't know if folks have seen that movie or remember, where the coach is the one teaching sex ed. And he says, if you have sex, you're going to get chlamydia and die, or you're going to get pregnant and die, right? So again, historically, the way that we've talked about sex with young people really has been using a lot of scare tactics because, and again, we'll talk about this, but the history of sex ed is that it was really encouraging students to not have sex until marriage. And these scare tactics were ways to dissuade young people from engaging in sexual activities before they were married. I'm also seeing someone in the chat saying that their physical teacher had to double as their health teacher. And they think that they only had health class for 1 quarter and the rest of the year was PE. Yeah, I also think that that's something pretty common. And again, that Mean Girls example, the coach is the one teaching the sex ed course. So thank you to everybody for sharing. I know my sex ed education was not very consistent. It was very reproductive and biology focused when I was in 7th grade and got it. And when I had to take it again in 9th grade, we had 2 guest speakers come in, a married couple, and they talked about their past history of sex before marriage, and they really again, with the scare tactics, talked about, how exposed they were to diseases and infections before they were married, and they should have waited. They wish they had waited. Now that they're married, they can have a true relationship. And at the end of the class, they passed out little pins or buttons for my classmates and me that said, "I'm worth the wait." So it was very much pushing an abstinence until marriage approach. And I remember even when I was, 14, 15, getting that lesson, having a lot of questions and not necessarily buying into the messaging. So thank you everybody for sharing. I think it's always really interesting to hear the different perspectives that people have and their different experiences, again, depending on what community they grow up in, what their parents are like, what their schools were like. So thank you for sharing. So the next thing that I did want to talk about was to take a look at what the history of sex ed has been like in this country. So a lot of the information that I got comes from the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the US. So this was an organization that was created in the 60s in order to expand what sex ed looked like, and to really do an assessment of what sex ed looks like. So we will be sharing this recording on our resource inventory page, as well as the different resources that I'm going to be sharing. So you'll be able to access this information on our resource inventory page once that's posted. So this is a picture of what sex ed has historically looked like in this country. So it starts with the eugenics movement, which there's a lot of history with the eugenics movement, but essentially the eugenics movement believed that the human race would be improved if only certain people reproduced. So it actually has deep history in racism, classism, ableism, sexism, and really looking at who was, again, worthy of reproducing, whose genes should be passed on. So really, when this was created, the idea was that it was white, middle-class, Anglo-Saxon people, able-bodied, who should be reproduced, and people who did not fit into those categories were not worthy of reproduction. And so really this was a way to control people of different ethnic backgrounds and levels of ability. So from the eugenics movement, that evolved into what was called the social hygiene movement. So the social hygiene movement happened very early on in the 1910s and 20s, the turn of the 20th century, and again was really marked by racist and classist fears that the social norms of what had been the Victorian era were breaking down, and that the institution of the family was under threat. At this time, marriage rates were down and divorce rates were on the rise. And in addition to that, the birth rate among white Americans and their families was dropping. So the proponents of the social hygiene movement said that the biggest proof of society's moral decline were the high rates of what they called prostitution and venereal diseases, especially as they started to see those things beginning to rise among middle-class white people, specifically middle-class white men. And so this policy, this movement, was used to justify existing political hierarchies in the name of science and morality. So a lot of the history of sex education in this country. So first of all, it started outside of schools. These were conversations that were happening in churches. They were happening in community spaces. And really it was aimed at addressing these, again, quote unquote, moral issues that were impacting white men. Really, sex education was in the early days not provided to white women because there was still this perpetual idea that white women were pure, were innocent, were not interested in sexual activity, but that white men were being tempted by what they called prostitutes, sex workers at the time, and also really looked down upon sexual relationships that happened across racial and ethnic lines. So from that social hygiene movement, we move into what was called the Chicago experiment. And so the Chicago experiment was created by a superintendent of a school district in Chicago at the time. This superintendent, her name was Ella Flagg Young, and she engaged in something called personal purity talks. So now we kind of finally see sex education moving into the realm of schools for youth. And so Ella Young believed that teaching about sex would not only improve health overall for folks, but would have, again, these positive ethical effects as well. So again, really looking at how sexual education was meant to enhance our ideas around marriage and what a successful heteronormative binary relationship looked like. So what she did was she actually brought her ideas to the school board and received permission to host a series of lectures that were actually lectured by physicians. So there was some medical and biological information that was provided to folks. And so over the course of the 1913 to 1914 school year, actually at least 20,000 Chicago students participated in these lectures. So something else about sex ed that used to happen in the past was it was really focused on one-time presentations, which again, many of us in this space are preventionists. And I was talking earlier about dosage. And if we look at strategies for prevention education, we know that dosage or hearing messages more than once on a consistent basis is a more effective strategy than doing one-time presentations, right? So that's how sex ed started in this country. So really, again, so we look at disease prevention. That is what was a really big goal of sex ed in the past. And so this idea was that, again, rates of STIs were increasing, and the belief was that those rates were increasing because sex was happening outside of the confines of heterosexual marriage. And so that's when doctors and biologists started becoming part of the sex ed curriculums because folks were wanting to share that information about medicine and how folks were affected. So from there, we move into what was called the Chamberlain-Conn Act. And so the Chamberlain-Conn Act was one of the first times that government money and federal dollars were dedicated to sex education. So this was actually in the 1919-1920 school year. So we're still looking, wow, this is so weird. It's like 100 years ago. It's 2023. So this act provided $4 million to train teachers specifically about STIs so that those teachers could then train high school students. So again, this was really the first time ever that federally funded dollars were dedicated to sex education. But again, the type of information that students were getting about sex ed, now it included information about STIs, but it was still really focused on ensuring that heterosexual marriages were where sex should be happening. And any sex that happened outside of those marriages really put you at risk and was really morally unethical. So then we move into what was called family life education. So this really gained traction and popularity in the 1940s and 1950s. And actually the principles of family life education still continue in some communities until this day. Typically not so much in California because of California's sex ed mandates, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, but is still, it still has roots in some of the education that's happening today. So this family life education was described as part preparation for marriage, part an attempt to discourage premarital sex, and now part training for what they called responsible parenting. So rather than focusing on the single agenda that had brought it into being, which was the single standard of sexual behavior and the prevention of STIs, sex education was now starting to become more comprehensive and more all-encompassing. So it expanded to cover almost everything that would be considered under the umbrella of family and personal living. So now we started seeing sex education expanding from just being about STIs prevention and premarital sex prevention to really looking at what it means to start a family and how to raise a family. So a lot of this education was happening in tandem with courses like home economics and life studies that were meant to equip young people with tools on how to be effective parents and adults. So that lasted for a while. And then we move into the Reagan administration in the 80s, where there was the creation of a new federal funding stream, which came under what was called the Adolescent and Family Life Act. And again, the goal of this education was to support what they called chastity education. So again, continuing this legacy of sex ed really being about preventing sexual activity before marriage. So then we move, we're still in the 80s, going into the early 90s, where communities are now being impacted by the AIDS epidemic. So once the AIDS epidemic started, there was initially still not any movement around bringing AIDS education into the classroom because of things like Miranda was sharing earlier, right? This assumption that education around AIDS and HIV didn't need to be provided to heterosexual people because heterosexual people were not at risk of getting AIDS or HIV. And there was a lot of stigma impacting the LGBTQIA plus community because of AIDS. And because of that stigma, because it was seen as impacting the LGBTQIA plus community, there was not an urgency in addressing the problem. There was not an urgency into talking folks about AIDS and HIV prevention. But eventually, as the conversation really entered the general public's knowledge, the government began to offer funding to states that mandated AIDS education. And eventually, state legislatures took up the cause. So the federal government does have influence on sexual education, primarily through the creation of these funding streams. But these funding streams are then allocated to states, and then from the states to local governments, from city governments to local school districts. So by 1990, 41 states encouraged or required sex education. And by 1990, all 50 states required education on HIV and AIDS. So eventually, those conversations did enter the mainstream. But from there, a continuation of those early days of sex ed, we move into the abstinence-only movement. So like the social hygiene movement and the family life education programs of the past, abstinence only or abstinence only until marriage programs, as they were called, were based on racist, classist, and sexist views of sex and marriage, and really sold that ideal view of the white middle-class family as being aspirational, as being what folks should be seeking to attain. So in fact, the first big investment in abstinence only until marriage programs came as part of the sweeping, we call it welfare reform, which was a big thing in the 80s and the 90s. So welfare reform itself was designed to promote middle-class values and punish poor women for having what they called too many children. So those who were pushing these welfare reform policies, they argued that the root of poverty was in fact personal characteristics of poor women on welfare who were irresponsible, promiscuous, and willing to have children outside of marriage. And we started to see descriptions of what we call the myth of the welfare mother, which stereotypically was considered to be a Black inner city woman who continued to have children in order to live off of government subsidies. So really saying that women, and in particular poor Black women who were living in the inner cities, were having children only to gain access to government subsidies. And really, this was being perpetuated by President Reagan as this was happening. And it really continued into the 1990s and even had legacy into recent history. One of the Board of Supervisors in LA's Board of Supervisors, her name is Holly Mitchell. And before Holly Mitchell was on Los Angeles's County Board of Supervisors, she was a state senator in California's legislature. And she many, many times brought welfare reform policies to the state legislature that were really meant to counter these stereotypical ideas of the welfare mother. So there started to be more funding increasing for states, but this funding increase was to really be available for abstinence only until marriage curricula and speakers. So in addition to a lot of these policies having religious biases, the curricula also contained gender messages that justified a world in which boys will be boys, right? Something that we still sometimes hear, and that girls needed to help keep boys in control. So there was a program called Sex Respect that told young girls really to watch what you wear, I'm sorry. If you don't aim to please, you don't aim to tease, right? And really suggested biological reasons for these rules, with these ideas that young men had a natural desire for sex that was due to their testosterone and their growth hormones, and that women were being culturally conditioned to even fantasize about sex as well. So again, something that still is perpetuated until today, right? A big set of messages that we talk about during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and even on Denim Day is this idea that, people ask for sexual assault to happen to them, right? Again, that boys and men can't control themselves. And so women have to do what they can in order to prevent sexual assaults from happening to them, right? We call this risk reduction. So that was a big part of this abstinence only movement. And while those social hygienists of those early 1900s that we talked about really called out gender differences in an attempt to get white men to improve their behavior, the abstinence only folks of the 2000s were pretty much generally focused on the prevention of promiscuous behavior in young women. So then we move into finally looking at the Obama administration and the creation of what was called the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. And this was under a program that was started under the Obama administration, which was the Office of Adolescent Health. And the Office of Adolescent Health fits under the Department of Health and Human Services. So that agency didn't exist before, but was created during the Obama administration. And essentially what the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program did was create a new funding stream to support programs that were medically accurate, age appropriate, and evidence-based. So this program received $110 million in funding, and it supported programs that had been evaluated and proven to reduce teen pregnancy and the behavioral risk factors that led to teen pregnancy and other associated risk factors. And this funding was also available to organizations that were evaluating new approaches to pregnancy prevention. So continuing on in 2010, under the Office of Adolescent Health, there was something called Title V funding. And this stream was actually revived under the Affordable Care Act. And the next year, Congress created a new discretionary funding stream called the Community Abstinence Education Grant Program. So there was a big trajectory of where sex ed started and where it is today. Historically, sex ed has ignored the role of institutional racism and socioeconomic status, right? It inaccurately assumed that all young people have an equal chance of being middle class as an adult. And we know that there are all kinds of barriers for people of many communities from being able to access that socioeconomic status that are out of their control, and again, are attributed to institutional racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these different things that we talk about today in terms of health equity. So I want to move on to what sex ed currently looks like in California. So in 2015, a law was passed in California called the California Healthy Youth Act, and it was implemented January 1st of 2016. So the California Healthy Youth Act has 5 primary purposes. And some of you may be familiar with, we call it CHYA. Some of you, this might be something new, but I'm really hoping that you'll see how your work might fit into this. So it helps provide pupils with knowledge and skills to protect their sexual and reproductive health from HIV and other sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancy. It provides students with the knowledge and skills they need to develop healthy attitudes concerning adolescent growth and development, which includes body image, gender, social or sexual orientation, relationships, marriage, and family. It's meant to promote understanding of sexuality as a normal part of human development. It looks to ensure students receive integrated, comprehensive, accurate, and unbiased sexual health and HIV prevention instruction, and provides educators with clear tools and guidance to accomplish that end, and to provide students with the knowledge and skills necessary to have healthy, positive, and safe relationships and behaviors. So again, really looking at sex ed being as comprehensive as possible. So there are a lot of requirements under CHYA, and I'm not going to go through all of these because there's a lot of points here, but generally what you should know about CHYA requirements is that it says that instruction should be provided at least once in junior high or middle schools, and then again in high school. So it has to provide education on HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. It has to provide information about accessing sexual and reproductive health care and how it interfaces with sexual assault and intimate partner violence, as well as students' rights to access these resources. It also looks to be inclusive of LGBTQIA+ conversation. So in contrast to things like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which, if you haven't heard, was just expanded, I think, yesterday to now include middle and high school students, right? Initially, that law was only targeting elementary school students, but it has now been expanded to cover middle and high schools, saying that LGBTQIA+ conversations can't happen in schools outside of the context of specific sex ed requirements. And again, it has to include information about sexual harassment, sexual assault, adolescent relationships, right? So a lot of what we do as domestic violence and sexual assault preventionists really fits into a lot of these CHYA requirements. So I also just wanted to point out a couple of challenges with these abstinence only. And something I actually meant to say, one of the other requirements of CHYA is that sex ed cannot be limited to abstinence only. Abstinence can be part of the conversation, but it can't be the only conversation. So abstinence only until marriage programs often ignore those in most need. So it excludes LGBTQIA+ youth, right? Again, because it's really focusing on marriage as being something heteronormative. It also erases youth who have experienced sexual trauma because, again, this education says that any sexual activity outside of marriage is unacceptable and dangerous. And so if a a young person has already been impacted by sexual violence, this is sending the message that something is wrong with them. And really doesn't offer an avenue for redemption. And it can also stigmatize pregnant and parenting teens. According to a 2014 study, about 25,000 women under the age of 20 became pregnant in 2010. And out of those teen pregnancies, 11,000 were among girls age 14 and younger. And so really what this is telling us is that pregnant and parenting students also need realistic sex education programs. And telling them that they've caused harm to themselves is really not the answer, right? And so they really need support in how to be parents. So one program I wanted to highlight is Lumina Alliance's sex education program. So Malin, I think, is here still. Malin from Lumina Alliance was kind enough to share with me some information about how Lumina implements sex ed in their schools. So Lumina serves the San Luis Obispo community in the Central Coast and is a dual domestic violence and sexual assault organization. So they use a curriculum called Positive Prevention Plus, which is an evidence-based comprehensive sex ed curriculum that meets the requirements of CHYA. It's available for purchase. It includes all kinds of things like pre and post tests, parent materials in Spanish and English, assignments that can be completed with a parent or trusted adult. And so at Lumina, they again use the Positive Prevention Plus curriculum. They have a fit within 2 weeks, and it is still CHYA compliant. So part of why Lumina goes into schools and implements is because a lot of teachers have discomfort around talking about these. And so there's more ease when a guest speaker approaches. Lumina provides this education for free to eliminate that as being a barrier for schools. And so they really work with teachers and schools to make sure that schools are comfortable while they are still ensuring that they are CHYA compliant. So an example that Malin shared with me of how they make adaptations might be around the condom demonstration, right? So traditionally, Lumina likes to offer students the ability to practice putting on a condom themselves, but sometimes teachers are uneasy with that. And so they have the option to just demonstrate to young people how to put on a condom. And really, they try and provide reasoning to the teachers as to why condom demonstrations are important, to really encourage youth to know how to safely and effectively use a condom, because students are more likely to experience condom failures, which can then lower condom effectiveness. And a lack of knowledge on how to use a condom can discourage condom use. Something else that they do is they offer an anonymous question box. I think that was something Miranda was talking about earlier, where students can anonymously ask questions. And they have students give them their questions at the end of class, and they come back the next day after having reviewed those questions so that they can make sure that they're offering the correct medically accurate information. So here's an example of an activity of what Lumina does in a school. This is the birth control game. It happens on day 5. And you can see on your screen, there are different examples of types of birth control. And then students are given descriptions of what each type of birth control does. And then students have to match the type of birth control with the description of how it works. So really educating students on what this looks like. So the California Department of Education actually offers checklist for guest speakers, because again, there is an understanding that teachers might not be comfortable teaching sex ed, and many teachers and schools reach out to outside organizations to do this education. So again, we'll share this link, but really a lot of these checklist questions for guest speakers are, again, just ensuring that the education that they're providing is CHYA compliant, that it's age appropriate, that it's medically accurate, that it's available to English language learners in different languages, that the instruction materials don't perpetuate ideas of any specific instructions, that it's free from promoting bias against any protected class of people. So you can check out ways to be an effective guest speaker when it comes to implementing sex ed. So we are getting close to the end of our presentation, but I'm just wondering if anybody wants to share either in the chat or by coming off of mute why a violence preventionist might consider implementing sex ed. So I'm actually thinking we're done at 11:30. We're done at 12, so we have a little bit more time. So why might violence preventionists consider implementing sex ed? So I would love to hear from anybody in the space what your ideas might be. Malin, if you are in the space still, because I can't see because I'm on share mode, but if you're here and you feel comfortable, I would love to hear why Lumina first started expanding their education to include sex ed. But again, really this question is for anybody. So why might violence preventionists consider implementing sex ed? You can either put it in the chat, or again, I'm happy to have folks come off of mute.
Hi, this is Erica from YWCA.
Hi, Erica.
And our team has recently been really talking about adding sex ed to our curriculum with our T clubs, our high school groups. We just think it just goes hand in hand in preventing sexual violence. If we can't talk about sex, then how are we going to talk about sexual violence? So we really just want to install these leaders with the correct information. We know that peers get their information, our students get their information from their peers, so we just want them to have correct information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, you definitely bring up a great point, right? That a lot of youth who are not engaging in these conversations with adults in their lives are getting this information from their peers. And they often get it from the internet or from social media, which might not be providing medically accurate and inclusive information about sexual activity. And yeah, I do think that there is value in talking about healthy sexuality as opposed to sexual assault and sexual violence, right? And being able to really walk students through what those two differences are, right? Because some people still perpetuate the idea that sexual assault or sexual violence is just, bad sex. And so by being able to really address sexual assault and how sexual assault is about power and control, you can contrast that with looking at what healthy sexuality is, and really hone in on conversations that include discussing things like boundaries and consent. And so if students are getting exposed to those conversations around healthy sexuality, sensuality as part of sexual health, boundary setting, and consent, the goal is to really prevent sexual assault and sexual violence from occurring in the first place. And really, preventionists many of you are already on school campuses, again, fulfilling at least one component of CHYA, which is that education around building healthy relationships, recognizing intimate partner violence, and learning about sexual assault and sex trafficking. And so preventionists would only need to expand that education to include some of this other information in order to be CHYA compliant. Any other ideas from folks? Are you thinking about implementing sex ed as part of your prevention strategy? Is it something you've never thought of before? Is it something that you might be interested in implementing? Again, why might, as preventionists, we consider expanding our education to include sex ed? Just wanting to see if there are any other ideas from folks.
Right. So I think definitely for the month of April, my team and I have been presenting workshops on consent and doing activities about what is sexual assault, what is bad sex, and providing that information. But I think it's now, having gone through this this workshop myself, I think it's really important for us to not only do this for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but to do it throughout the year. And this is such essential information. A lot of the feedback that we get from students after workshops, like, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about relationships, because adults don't talk to us about that. And so I can see adults or parents or caregivers shying away from having conversations about sex because, the thought is, well, if I talk to them about sex, I'm encouraging them to do so. So if they're not talking about creating boundaries and healthy relationships and relationship red flags, they're not doing it about sex either. So it's just really important. And we had a really powerful moment this week at Bellflower High School, where we were talking about consent, and we were doing the activity about good sex or sexual assault. And there was a student there that was like really asking questions like, wait, so if this, and she was giving scenarios, and you can tell that this is something that she experienced. And she was just having the realization that she had experienced sexual assault. So it was really impactful. And I think these are important conversations, because it's not just about boundaries and communication, but part of promoting healthy relationships is talking about sexual health. So this is definitely something that I just wrote an email to my director about. Hey, can we get this curriculum? Can we get this training? Because this is important.
Thank you, Griselda. Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point, right? When you pointed out the fact that as you were providing education around sexual assault and sexual violence, you had a student who, as they processed this information, started to recognize that they may have been impacted by sexual violence personally. And I think that many of us can probably relate to that scenario, right? I know that definitely it's something that I've experienced many times. Before I came to the partnership, I was a preventionist at a dual domestic violence and sexual assault organization in Los Angeles. And I provided prevention education to a lot of different audiences, to students in middle and high school, to parents, to teachers, to business professionals, to athletes, to formerly incarcerated people. And in all of these various settings, over time, I did get a number of people who, similar to Griselda's experience, would recognize, oh crap, I think this is something that happened to me, right? Once they got the information. And so, thinking about why preventionists might want to consider implementing sex ed is because we do have that experience talking specifically about sexual violence and intimate partner violence, right? So if a teacher were to be implementing this education and a student was triggered because they realized that they were impacted by sexual violence, that teacher may or may not have the tools to address that situation coming up with a student. But we have those resources, right? We know the statistics. We know how to support survivors. We have the resources that we can share with students immediately, right? And many of us have undergone the 40-hour domestic violence training or the 65 to 80-hour dual domestic violence and sexual assault counselor advocate training. And so if a person goes into crisis, many of us have those skills to address that crisis as it's going on. And so I think that that is another benefit to preventionists being some of those folks that implement sex education, right? I think it's great when teachers can do this. And I believe that we should be empowering more teachers to feel comfortable having these conversations with students. But it can also be really helpful to utilize folks like us who have some of this additional information. Anybody else? I just want to give another opportunity to folks to consider why we might be effective people in implementing sex education.
Yeah. Hi, Melody. It's Malin. So
Hi, Malin.
I don't know if my phone says, I'm on my phone, if it says Zoom or iPhone or Malin, but yeah, I wanted to just echo everything that everyone is saying. And originally why Lumina Alliance started to do sex ed was actually to help a community partner organization who lost all of their funding for sex ed and providing sex ed to the community. And so they reached out to us and they had asked if we could help provide to areas that needed it done and couldn't pay for it. And so we were like, yeah, like, of course we would do that. So we started to do that. But as we were doing that, it was something that we realized the importance of it and the impact we were making because of all of the reasons that everyone has shared, and the importance of it. I know, like, it can seem overwhelming and it can seem, like a lot of information in 2 weeks of back-to-back lessons, but being in the classroom with students and seeing them take in these messages and seeing them take in this information, it is just such a beautiful experience. We were just with 7th graders and we did sex ed, and it was an amazing experience. And you could tell by their questions that they were so interested and engaged with the conversation in a way that this was brand new information to them. And we've seen that going into high schools as well. And just like how you were talking about boundaries and consent, boundaries and consent being an important part of this curriculum. That's maybe something that isn't being talked about anywhere else. And so if for the first time students are hearing it in sex ed and they're hearing it connected to sex and why it's important for sex and the difference between sex and sexual assault, again, you can see those conversations and their eyes light up and them having those wheels turning. So it's a really amazing program and it's great to implement. And I really highly encourage anyone who does have the capacity to consider implementing it into their prevention programming. And I just want to say too, like, I know the curriculum can be costly and I know, not everybody has access to funds, but there are templates and, I shared with Melody our curriculum. And if that's something that other people are interested in viewing or getting education around, like, I can be a resource as well. So yeah, but I just wanted to put that out there. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Malin. It's great hearing how you all came to implementing sex ed and what kind of led you to doing this. And I think, coming out of collaboration with a partner is great. And yeah, I mean, I have been in those situations too, where you just see students being so appreciative of getting this information, because like you said, a lot of times they have not had access to this education. Adults in their lives are not having these conversations with them. And so they can be really thirsty for this sort of information because we're finally giving them answers to questions that they might have. So I just want to appreciate everybody for sharing their thoughts around this. And again, I want to encourage you to explore what adding sex ed education into the work that you're doing might offer. So I also just want to point out that Miranda dropped the survey for this presentation in the chat. So whenever you get a chance, we'll also email this out to everybody. But if you could take a moment to fill out that survey, those really help us in tailoring our presentation topics to really meet y'all's needs. So one thing that Malin pointed out to me as we were talking about how Lumina facilitates sex ed, and something that the prevention team at the partnership has really been focusing on, is the issue of schools actually not being in compliance with CHYA. So even though CHYA is mandated across the state for all publicly funded schools, there are many schools and school districts that are out of compliance and are not providing sex ed either at all or in the way that meets all of the requirements of CHYA. So what I would love for us to maybe think about next, and I would love, again, if anybody wants to share either in the chat or by coming off of mute, but what do you think are some of those challenges or barriers to implementing sex ed? Why might schools, school districts, even parents be in opposition to implementing sex ed as it's mandated by CHYA? So sex ed as it's meant to be comprehensive, inclusive, medically accurate, right? So what might be some of those challenges or barriers? I'd love to hear any ideas that folks have. Again, you can either come off of mute or you can put your response in the chat. But why might schools or parents be hesitant to talk to students in a way that is medically accurate, not focus on abstinence only, inclusive of the LGBTQIA+ community, and addressing sexual assault and intimate partner violence? What do we think? What might be some of those arguments opposed to that sort of sex ed?
So for us here in SLO, we have a lot of different, towns, and each one has its own individual political climate in a sense, and it can vary from town to town, even school to school, what they believe should be implemented or talked about. For example, I had a parent come up to me, and I take my dogs to the park, and I had a parent who has a dog and came up to me and was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was telling her, and I was talking about sex ed, and she said, "Oh, okay, I homeschool my kids, and I was wondering, can you send me the curriculum?" And I said, "Yeah, I would definitely be interested in that. And I can send that over to you." She was like, "Yeah, I probably won't implement it, and I don't want them to get that education because, are they really teaching about LGBTQIA identities?" And I was like, I was a little taken aback, and I was like, yeah, they are. It's important, and it's included in the curriculum, and it's part of the law, and just explaining that. And it's those things where it's like parents, again, just like people have said in this conversation, is like, if you talk to kids about sex, you're going to make them have sex or encourage them to have sex. If you talk to, kids about LGBTQIA identities or sexualities, they're going to become LGBTQIA. And like, that's not how it works, but that's a lot of parents' fear. And with principals, one thing that we see a lot of, especially if they're a newer principal, they're scared. And they're scared of parents pushing back and what that could possibly mean for them and their position. So it's a big combination of those things, which is really hard, and especially when a whole town has a climate to them or has a perspective that is keeping this education out, when again, it is a part of the law.
Yeah, thank you, Malin. I appreciate you sharing from your firsthand experience. And so, yeah, I think you point out a lot of different things, right? One thing I think that's important that you said is that each school and each community is its own community, right? And so there are different ideas about what is acceptable or not, often from community to community. And so pushback in one school or community might be different than acceptance or pushback at another school or community. You also pointed out some hesitation around LGBTQIA plus inclusion, right? And there are some folks who perpetuate myths and stereotypes about the LGBTQIA plus community that make them hesitant or opposed to talking about gender identity, sexual orientation with students at an early age. And then you mentioned, as I think Griselda mentioned earlier, that there can be this idea that if we talk to students about sex, we think that we are encouraging them to have sex. And the data just shows that that is not the case, right? That there are just as high rates of sexual activity and pregnancy in students who receive abstinence-only education. And so we know that students are not engaging in more sexual activity just because we're talking to them about it. And really the whole purpose is to provide youth with education so that if and when they engage in sexual activity, they have the education to stay as safe as possible. Are there any other ideas that anybody can come up with as to why there might be challenges to sex ed in schools?
I know that we sometimes, Erica, again, I know sometimes that we receive pushback because teachers don't want to lose class time. And just hard just like getting into the class. And then also just teachers' ideas of what we're doing. We recently were at a school doing a sexual assault 101 presentation, and one teacher in particular opted out because they told the presenter that they didn't want us to push our political agenda on them. So also like teachers not really having a clear idea of like who we are and what we're doing.
Yeah, you bring up great points. So the first thing you highlighted, I think many of us have faced, even if we're not including sex ed, right? But that there can be pushback that there's just not enough time to talk about these issues. Yeah, and then I think, you also bring up this idea of like pushing a political agenda. And I think that's what's helpful about being able to point to something like CHYA and say, this has nothing to do with us. This has nothing to do with a political agenda. This has to do with what the government has outlined is required for sex ed to include. But again, the challenge is that many schools are out of compliance with CHYA. And as Malin and I talked about, and again, as the prevention team at the partnership has been exploring as we've been looking into CHYA compliance, is that there really is no governing body to hold schools accountable. So there really are currently no consequences for schools not being CHYA compliant. So many schools take this as a sign that they do not have to be in compliance. So the partnership is actually working actively right now to brainstorm different ideas of how we can bring more schools into compliance so that students are getting this comprehensive sex ed that we are hoping that they will get. So some of the challenges to sex ed that I have kind of seen, and many of us have seen around the state and around the country, are some of the things here. So some folks believe that sex education should be out of the scope of what schools should be teaching. That schools should just be focused on math and English and science and history and not include conversations about sex ed or relationships. And really, those conversations are meant to be had with parents. Another challenge is students' ages, right? So there are some school districts like San Francisco Unified School District that starts conversations about sexual education and consent and healthy relationships as early as elementary school. But even with middle schoolers being mandated to get this education, there are some folks who think that these are too young of ages to be having these conversations with students. As Malin pointed out, some schools and parents have hesitancy around CHYA because of its mandate to include information about the LGBTQI+ community. Some folks balk at the fact that sexual education has been expanded beyond abstinence only. So for some folks, that is the correct way to implement sex ed. And if sex ed addresses anything other than abstinence only, that is overreaching and is not providing the right kind of education to students. Also, the conversations around contraceptives can make some people uncomfortable with this sort of education if they have personal beliefs around the appropriateness of contraceptives. And as different folks have pointed out today, there's also the idea of teachers' comfort, right? Many teachers were not trained on how to have sexual education conversations with students. Many teachers might be uncomfortable talking about sex themselves. And so if teachers are the ones who are mandated to provide this education, that might be something that is challenging for some teachers. And again, might be a benefit in having outside organizations coming in to provide this kind of education. So for folks who are interested in advocating for change to try and encourage their schools to be in compliance with CHYA, there are some strategies that you can use. And these are really good strategies when trying to advocate for any kind of change, right? So we want to define the issue. That's one of the first steps when we think about the public health approach to violence prevention, is first we have to really identify what is going on, who's impacted, what are the statistics, what's missing, how are people being impacted, right? We want to get a picture of what the problem looks like. Then we want to identify our allies. So do we have other partner organizations? Can we get legislators on board? Can we engage with faith leaders to be part of these conversations? We want to build a broad-based coalition of many different voices. You also want to identify your target audience. So are you talking to teachers? Are you talking to the school board? Are you advocating with your local legislator? You want to figure out who you're talking to so that you can tailor your message to that audience. And part of that includes having a clear ask. So what is it that you're asking for? And you want to be as specific as possible so that the audience you're talking to has a really clear picture of what you're looking to address and what you're aiming for. And then finally, you want to really spread the word. You want to get as many people involved as possible, again, so that you have a broad base of voices being part of the conversation. You can use social media to do this. You can offer to write an op-ed in your local paper. There are all kinds of different strategies for spreading the word and a lot of tools that we can take advantage of in this day and age with social media and technology. So again, just a few more strategies for advocating for sex ed, right? Again, you want to involve a diverse group of community members to really demonstrate that there is shared interest in providing this type of education to students, and that it'll meet the needs of many different types of communities and community members. It can also be really important to get to know your local school board. So school boards are often that local government body that are mandating what schools implement, and they can help be a guide in holding schools accountable. So you want to get to know your school board, get to know who's on that school board, what are some of those personal interests that they might have, and how can you speak to their individual interests in a way that advocates for why sex ed should meet their needs. And included in that is being an active citizen during school board elections. So if you have the ability to vote and you can vote on school board elections, that can be something that's also really useful, so that you're really influencing who is on that school board, and hopefully really championing somebody who's going to advocate for sexual education that's comprehensive and inclusive in schools. So I thought that this quote was really great. It comes from that organization, CHYA, that I was referencing a few times during the presentation. And it really encourages people to look at sexual education as a tool to address social justice in our communities. So I love this quote and I want to read it. If allowed, sex education can continue to help us dismantle the systems of power, oppression, and misinformation that are at the heart of efforts to deny sexual and reproductive freedom to individuals and groups. It can model LGBTQ inclusion, support sexual violence prevention, and tackle racial, sexualized stereotypes that put people of color at greater risk of experiencing violence. It can debunk harmful gender stereotypes, define and promote enthusiastic consent practices, and empower each of us to claim the right to our own bodily autonomy. I just think this is really cool, right? We're always looking at ways to address the different intersections that people live at, and thinking about sex ed in an inclusive and comprehensive way can really help us in addressing multiple forms of systemic and interpersonal violence that people are impacted by, based on their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their race, their abilities, their class, all of these different classifications that might make people targets. Yes, and I'm getting some yeses in the chat. So that's all of the information that I have for you today. We have 4 more minutes left. If you need to jump out, you can jump out. Please click on that SurveyMonkey link to fill out the survey. Let us know what you thought about this presentation. But otherwise, if there are any questions that anybody has, I'm happy to answer those now. Well, I'll stick around if anybody needs anything. Otherwise, I just want to thank you all so much for being part of this webinar today. I had a really fun time talking about this topic. I hope it's something that we can continue to talk about in the future. And we will keep all of you updated as to what the partnership is doing to help schools move into compliance with CHYA, because we're really going to need as much support as possible from all of you. So thank you so much, and I hope that you all have a great day.